The descent onto Varelia 7 began with a low hum vibrating through the steel walls of the drop shuttle. Inside, 23 cadets representing 12 species of the Galactic Coalition sat in pristine rows, their posture stiff, their expressions unreadable behind shimmering visors and filtration masks. Every movement was calculated, every breath controlled by personal environmental stabilizers. To most of them, this was just another formality in their elite training, a survival assessment that, in their minds, was designed to confirm what their upbringing already taught them. Superiority was inherited, not earned. At the far end of the shuttle, alone on the last row, sat Jack Carter, the only human. He was slouched slightly, helmet resting on his knees, one hand gripping a small fabric pouch tied to his belt. Unlike the others, he wasn't dressed in a sterile synthetic survival suit, but in Earth-standard utility wear, breathable, patch-reinforced fabric stained by past use. His boots had mud from another planet still caked into the treads. His eyes scanned the digital readout above the bulkhead door, altitude decreasing, terrain analysis, oxygen-rich, stable gravity, soil density within agricultural thresholds. He smiled. The shuttle touched down with a soft jolt, the shock absorbers engaging silently. The moment the hatch hissed open, the alien cadets filed out in perfect order, their boots landing in unison on the dark, moss-covered ground. Their internal filters engaged instantly, releasing a faint buzz as invisible microsensors began scanning the air for pathogens. Most stood upright and motionless, waiting for Commander Irkon, a tall, tri-armed officer from the Siravic Dominion, to give the standard debriefing. Jack stepped out last, his eyes drawn not to the commander or the regimental formations, but to the ground itself. The soil was rich and black, covered in patches of spongy emerald moss and flecks of gray sediment. The air smelled faintly of rain and sap. Nearby, massive trees with translucent trunks and slowly pulsing veins reached into the cloud-streaked sky. Jack crouched down and let his fingers run through the dirt. It was cool and damp. He grinned and whispered, "Perfect." "Step away from the contaminated surface," a sharp voice ordered. Jack looked up and saw Cadet Varelion approaching, her silver armor reflecting the dull daylight. She was a Nithari, a race known for its aversion to microbial contact. Her expression, though hidden beneath a translucent face shield, radiated disdain. "You are endangering your biostability profile?" Jack stood up slowly. "It's just soil." "For you, perhaps," she replied coldly. "Some of us have evolved beyond the need to touch rot." Commander Irkon raised his three-fingered hand, silencing the murmurs. "Cadets," he began, his voice amplified through his chest-mounted speaker. "This is not a combat exercise. This is not a diplomatic test. This is what we call a primitive world simulation. You will live here for 8 standard weeks. No technology, no assistance, no automated support. Your task is to sustain life using what this planet provides. You will not receive supplies unless an emergency occurs. There is no medical extraction unless a fatality is imminent." Gasps erupted among the newer cadets. Several turned their helmets to face one another. The air was breathable, yes, but that meant direct exposure to organic environments. No shielding, no sterile food replication, no synthetic nutrient sprays. Jack exhaled slowly, watching the others fidget uncomfortably in their high-grade suits. "Bet none of you packed seeds," he muttered. Commander Irkon continued, "You will be divided into quadrants: food, shelter, water. These are your primary objectives. You will be graded based on independence, innovation, and efficiency. Any cadet caught using unauthorized tech will be disqualified. That includes translators, filtration masks, nanobot replicators, or auto-digesters." Varelion raised her hand. "Commander, some of us require biochemical regulation. Our digestive systems—" "Then you will adapt," Irkon interrupted, "as humans once did, as this exercise intends to prove." He turned to the others. "Dismissed. Begin." The cadets dispersed, but most stood awkwardly at the perimeter, unsure where to start. The terrain was unfamiliar. There were no clean surfaces to sit on, no structured command posts to default to. One cadet from the Zairan species attempted to scan a nearby fruiting bush, only to realize his bioanalyzer had been deactivated. Another kicked at the ground in frustration, muttering about the absurdity of soil-based tasks. Jack walked calmly toward a small clearing near a stream, set his pack down, and untied the cloth pouch. Inside were 10 small seed packets labeled in faded marker. Carrots, beans, spinach, chard, lettuce, basil, tomato, corn, peas, mint. His grandfather had given them to him years ago, wrapped in an old fishing net and sealed in a plastic bag. "Keep something alive," the old man had said. "It'll teach you more than anything else will." Jack began scanning the ground for sun exposure and drainage slope. He used a flat stone to dig narrow furrows in the soil, hands moving with deliberate slowness. The aliens watched from a distance, confused. Cadet Thrennick of the Zeloth Empire leaned in toward his partner and whispered, "Is he attempting to grow sustenance? From the ground?" "Barbaric," the other replied. But Jack didn't hear them. His focus was on depth, spacing, and orientation. He poured a small amount of water from his flask onto each row, patting down the earth after placing the seeds. Then he sat back and stretched. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the field. He looked around. No one else had done anything. No shelters, no water purification, no fire. The camp, if it could be called that, was just a scattered mess of discomfort and hesitation. The aliens were accustomed to command chains, not improvisation. Jack stood up, pulled out a collapsible tarp from his backpack, and used 2 branches to create a basic lean-to. He didn't need walls, just cover from the dew. That night, as the cadets lay uncomfortably in their suits, afraid to remove them, Jack slept in the open with his head resting on his pack and his hand still gripping the pouch of seeds. The stars above twinkled without interruption, and the wind carried the scent of wet soil and blooming moss across the valley. By morning, the first signs of condensation appeared on the inside of the alien suits. Jack stood, rubbed his eyes, and walked over to his planted rows. Nothing yet, of course, but the ground was still moist, and the sun was beginning to rise. He crouched, ran his hand across the dirt, and nodded to himself. The others began to stir, most of them groaning from stiffness, their bodies unused to lying in suits not designed for sleeping. A few watched Jack move back and forth between the stream and his planting rows. He'd fashioned a crude watering vessel from a thick leaf and a curled piece of bark. He didn't speak, he didn't lecture, he simply worked. Cadet Varelion walked by, eyes narrowed. "You enjoy this? The dirt, the sweat, the discomfort?" Jack stood up and looked at her. "I enjoy living. This is just how it starts." She didn't respond. She merely turned and walked away. Jack returned to his plot and checked the soil again. It wasn't just about feeding himself. He could have survived by foraging, setting traps, or boiling roots. But this was bigger than that. It was a statement, a quiet rebellion against the arrogance that floated in the air around the rest of the cadets. He wasn't here to prove humans were better. He was here to show that humility had its place, that survival didn't care for pride. And as the second night approached, while the others counted their ration bars and panicked over every buzz from a nearby insect, Jack sat beside his patch of soil, lit a small fire using a lens and dried moss, and cooked a handful of edible roots he had dug up nearby. The smell drifted through the air, earthy, smoky, real. Some watched in silence, others turned away. But something had changed. Not in the soil, not in the wind, but in the quiet pause between alien breaths, as if somewhere deep inside they realized that perhaps there was something to learn from the dirt after all. The morning air on Varelia 7 hung low and heavy with dew. Thin strands of mist drifted between the translucent trunks, forming curling ribbons that clung to the cadets' bodies as they stirred from uneasy sleep. Jack sat cross-legged beside his small planting rows, elbows on his knees, watching the sun push through the foliage. The sky was turning amber, and the soil beneath his fingers was still dark and damp, a good sign. He pinched a bit of the dirt, crushed it between his fingers, and nodded quietly to himself. The roots below would have time to spread before the next rainfall. Most of the cadets were still sitting stiffly in their suits, scanning the perimeter in a daze of irritation and discomfort. Cadet Trenar from the Vorthic Dominion was standing on a smooth rock, attempting to bypass the mission's restrictions by jury-rigging a micro-drone from leftover components he'd concealed in his armor. Commander Irkon noticed immediately and approached with a deliberate pace, his 3 arms clasped behind his back. Without speaking, he extended one long hand toward Trenar. The cadet reluctantly handed over the small device, and the commander crushed it in his grip. The act produced no sound, only a faint flicker of sparks. Jack watched silently as Trenar sulked away, the look in his eyes suggesting hunger more than humiliation. Jack turned back to his rows. Using a hollow reed he'd split with a sharp stone, he drew water from the nearby stream and slowly released it along the trenches he had dug. He had spent hours studying planetary hydrology back at Earth's Academy, and now every drop counted. Some aliens watched from a distance, still curious, still silent. None of them stepped forward. Cadet Varelion was pacing along the edge of the stream, her feet never once making contact with the soil. She walked on a series of flat stone slabs she had carefully wiped down the night before with sterile cloths from her emergency pack. She stopped to observe Jack and tilted her head slightly, her voice sharp but low. "How many units of water have you wasted on that patch of dirt, human?" Jack glanced over without stopping his work. "I'm not wasting it. I'm investing it." "Into what?" she asked, folding her arms. "Decay?" "Into something edible," he replied simply. Varelion scoffed and walked away without further comment. Her stride remained calculated and regal, but Jack noticed the brief glance she gave the soil. Just a flicker of attention, but one that hadn't been there the day before. By midday, the cadets had split into small groups, attempting to mimic command structures that had worked in controlled simulations. The problem was, no one wanted to touch anything. Food sources were identified by scanners, but since those devices were now deactivated, the aliens stared at the trees and shrubs in frustration, unsure what was safe. A small group attempted to trap one of the swift lizard creatures that darted through the tall grass, but without tools or basic knowledge of the environment, the effort ended in confusion. Jack watched one cadet from the Orith Alliance accidentally slap himself in the face with a poorly constructed vine trap. The others laughed. Hunger hadn't yet humbled them. Jack pulled out another set of seeds, this time beans, and dug a new row beside the first. He worked slowly, methodically, his fingers coated in dirt and clay. A sharp root scratched his knuckle, drawing a thin line of blood, which he wiped off on his pants without concern. He could feel his body settling into a rhythm, one he hadn't felt since the training exercises on Earth, deep in the highlands of old Scotland, where rain was a certainty and survival required calloused hands. Those memories grounded him, and now, thousands of light years from home, they guided every motion. He turned toward the stream and noticed something unexpected. Cadet Thrennick, the Xyloth who had sneered at him the day before, was kneeling near the water's edge. He wasn't touching the ground directly, he'd layered pieces of bark to create a platform, but he was attempting to filter water through a twisted coil of leaves and gravel. It was crude, ineffective, and leaking from the sides. Jack walked over and crouched beside him, staying just outside the bark mat. "You're close," he said, pointing to the coil. "Try placing the fine sand on top, not beneath the leaves. Otherwise, you're just pushing mud into your flask." Thrennick didn't respond. His pride wouldn't allow a direct thank you, but after a moment of hesitation, he adjusted the layers as Jack had suggested. The water that trickled through was still brown, but less so. Jack left him to it. Back at his rows, Jack checked the soil depth and adjusted the shadow lines. The trees here grew in spirals, creating gaps in the canopy that allowed bursts of light through at specific intervals. He aligned his trenches to capture those rays when they came, giving the seeds the best chance to photosynthesize once they sprouted. He didn't expect growth for at least 2 or 3 rotations, but he knew the importance of consistency, water, warmth, and patience. Just as he finished adjusting the final trench, a shadow loomed over him. He looked up to see Commander Irkon standing silently, his gaze fixed on the rows of dirt. The commander's visor was dimmed, reflecting only the broken clouds above. "You chose cultivation," Irkon said. It wasn't a question. Jack stood and brushed off his hands. "It's the only long-term solution that doesn't rely on luck or slaughter. Others call it regression. Because they've never been hungry." The commander remained silent for a moment longer, then nodded once and walked away without another word. By the time the second night settled, the camp had transformed into a scene of quiet disorder. Some cadets had tried to build raised platforms from sticks and vines, but most were unstable. Several aliens slept standing up, leaning against trees, afraid of lying down on the contaminated ground. Jack, by contrast, had added a second layer to his shelter. Woven palm fronds that caught the dew and funneled water into a carved stone basin. It wasn't much, but it was more than the others had, and still no one had planted anything. A rustle behind him made him turn. Cadet Varelion stood several meters away, her visor removed for the first time, revealing sharply sculpted features and eyes that shimmered with a natural bioluminescence. She pointed toward his rows. "What are those?" "Beans," Jack said. "And the others?" "Carrots, spinach, some herbs. A few of them will take longer, but some might show green in a day or two." She didn't move closer. "You touched the soil with your bare hands. You bled into it." "Yeah, that's life. You could have infected yourself, or worse, others." "Or," Jack said, "I could have planted the only thing that feeds everyone here in 2 weeks." She stared at him in silence, the muscles in her jaw tightening. Then she turned and walked away, vanishing into the mist. Jack sat back down, watching the sky turn dark again. Somewhere in the trees, strange birds croaked out long, low calls that echoed like metallic whistles. The stars shimmered faintly overhead, filtered by alien clouds. He lay down beside his plot and closed his eyes. His fingers were sore, his back ached, his stomach rumbled with hunger. But his mind was calm, because now the seeds were in, and soon the planet would answer. The third morning arrived quietly, with the sun slowly slicing through the heavy mist that clung to the canopy. Jack sat on his heels, unmoving, his gaze locked on the dark earth before him. His hands rested on his knees, fingers coated in dried dirt, and his breath formed short clouds in the cold air. He had risen before first light, not because of habit or necessity, but because he had felt something. An intuition honed not by training modules or lectures, but by time spent with his grandfather, where planting was a ritual and not a task. That feeling pulled him toward the patch before even the insects began their calls. Then he saw it. It was small, nothing more than a delicate green hook breaking through the soil. It arched toward the sky timidly, its stem still curled in a protective spiral. Jack's eyes narrowed with focus, but his mouth slowly curved into a smile. He leaned in closer and gently brushed away a layer of loose dirt around it. There were 3 others just like it. Bean shoots, early, healthy, eager. He exhaled, stood up slowly, and turned toward the stream. His movement caught the attention of Cadet Ralvax, a short, horned creature from the eastern quadrant. The cadet sat hunched under a broad-leafed plant, biting into the last strip of emergency protein gel from his suit's supply capsule. Jack walked past him, dipped his carved reed container into the water, and returned without saying a word. He trickled water around the base of each sprout, not touching the stems directly, and let the soil absorb what it could. From behind, a voice broke the silence. "What are they?" Jack didn't turn around. "Beans." "Is that real food?" the cadet asked, his voice cracking with doubt and curiosity. "It will be," Jack said. "Soon." Ralvax shifted in his position. His armor was smeared with dried sap and moss, a sign he had stopped trying to stay clean. He scratched at his shoulder and lowered his eyes toward the ground. "I tried eating something yesterday, red berries. Made my tongue numb." "You're lucky," Jack said, still crouching by the sprouts. "Some of those are paralytic. One of your teammates threw up blood the other night." Ralvax blinked and nodded once before slinking back toward his quadrant. Jack didn't watch him go. He focused again on the dirt, brushing a few pebbles aside. The tiny plants were vulnerable now. Any strong wind or careless footstep could crush them. He placed 3 flat stones around the cluster to mark them and moved back toward his shelter. Midday arrived with dry heat, breaking through the cool mist. The camp was now clearly divided. Those who continued to cling to sterile habits remained thin, silent, and increasingly disoriented. Others, mostly younger cadets or those who had seen hardship before enlisting, were adapting. Jack noticed a few of them now carried water in makeshift containers. A group of 3 had tried building a clay oven, though the walls had collapsed due to poor firing. Still, it was something. Commander Irkon had not intervened. He walked among the cadets without speaking, his eyes registering every attempt, every failure. His silence was deliberate. He had once told Jack during a module back on the Capitol station, "Survival is not about strategy, it is about surrendering pride." Those who couldn't surrender were visibly failing. Jack finished reinforcing the edges of his garden plot with small branches. His hands ached. His nails were filled with grime. His skin had peeled at the knuckles, but none of that mattered. He stood up and looked toward the center of the clearing where a group had gathered. It was Cadet Varelion again. Her posture was perfect. Her voice was clear. She stood on an improvised platform of overlapping leaves addressing the others. "This exercise is designed to break us," she said. "Not physically, but intellectually. We are forced to pretend that filth equals sustenance, that crawling through mud is necessary. This is a test of resolve, not just resourcefulness. We must not lose our identity in the process." Jack leaned against a tree nearby, arms crossed, watching the group listen. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked uneasy. Then a hand went up. It was Cadet Purr from the erosion sector. She had bright scales running down her neck and cheeks. "What if the mud is the solution?" she asked. "The human has food growing. I saw it." A ripple of murmurs moved through the group. Varelion's expression didn't change. "One plant does not feed 23 cadets." Jack stepped forward. "It's not just one." All eyes turned toward him. "There are sprouts, multiple rows. Some of the herbs are breaking through too. If the soil holds, if the weather stays consistent, we'll have enough for everyone in 2 weeks. 3 tops." Varelion crossed her arms. "And what will we do until then? Eat shadows?" "Figure something out," Jack said. "The point is, this works." She descended from the platform, her boots never touching the earth. "And when your crops rot? When disease seeps in through the roots and poisons everyone?" Jack shrugged. "Then at least we tried something real. You're welcome to keep waiting for the stars to feed you." She said nothing else. She turned and walked back to her sterile encampment, her steps rigid. That evening, as dusk settled and insects began chirping in rhythmic pulses, Jack returned to his plot with a handful of flat leaves. He placed them gently over the young shoots to guard against the cool air. As he worked, footsteps approached. It was Cadet Purr. She crouched beside him without speaking, watching the plants for a long time before asking, "Do you need help?" Jack paused. "You'd have to touch the dirt." "I've touched worse," she said, her voice soft. Jack nodded and handed her a stone scoop. "Start digging 3 rows over, same depth as this one. We'll rotate crops." She took the tool, pushed up the sleeves of her uniform, and dug in. Later that night, the glow from Jack's campfire flickered across the leaves. More sprouts had begun to emerge, small, quiet signs of life pushing through hostile ground. The others hadn't noticed yet, but Jack did, and so did Purr. It was beginning. The days on Varelia 7 stretched longer than expected, not in rotation, but in rhythm. By the 4th full cycle, the cracks in discipline had grown wider. Hunger gnawed at the edges of composure. Jack noticed the difference first in silence. Cadets who once mocked him now passed without a word, avoiding eye contact, their movements sluggish and erratic. Some still clung to their pride, standing on leaves or sleeping curled up in their suits, but their energy was fading. His garden had changed. The sprouts were no longer tender stems. They had become structured clusters of life. The beans had extended upward, curling around thin sticks he had anchored for support. The spinach had begun to fan out, its leaves vibrant and full. The carrots were not yet ready for harvest, but their tops were promising. It was the basil, though, that gave the clearest sign. The scent drifted beyond his garden now, carried by the warm winds. That smell began to draw eyes. Jack had expanded the plot with Cadet Purr's help. She worked beside him every morning and evening, her scaled arms now stained with dirt. She asked questions sometimes, mostly about irrigation or spacing, but she spoke little otherwise. Jack appreciated that. He had grown tired of arguing. His answers were in the ground now. One afternoon, as he watered the edges of a new trench, Cadet Ralvax approached with hesitant steps. The cadet looked thinner than before, the skin beneath his horns slightly pale. He carried a bent metal plate filled with berries, small, round, and bright red. Jack stood and eyed the offering warily. "Thought I could trade these," Ralvax said. We scanned them early on, some match edible patterns. Jack took one and turned it over in his fingers. Looks like artist fruit. Might be safe in small amounts, might not. Ralvax looked down. You got real food. Sprouts, leaves, that green stuff that smells like home. Basil, Jack said. Yeah, that. Jack glanced over at Purr, who was pulling weeds near the mint section. Then he looked back at Ralvax. We don't have enough yet. When we do, I'll let you know. Ralvax's shoulders slumped, but he nodded and walked away, the berries untouched. That evening, 3 cadets stood at the edge of Jack's garden, arms crossed, watching without speaking. Jack ignored them and continued reinforcing the structure around his beans. Pierre stood beside him, tying a vine around a support stick. One of the cadets, tall and broad with dull golden armor, finally stepped forward. I know what that is, he said. That's chard. I saw it in the Earth Archive. You boiled it in salt water and called it a delicacy. Jack glanced at him. Never needed salt to make it good. The cadet shifted his weight. You gonna share it? When it's ready? Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The garden was visible. The work had been seen. He stood, wiped his hands on his pants, and said, When it feeds more than 2 mouths, yes, but you'll have to help. The other cadet snorted. I'm not digging in mud. Then you're not eating what comes from it, Jack replied. The cadet turned away with a sneer, but not before Jack saw him glance one more time at the wide, veined leaves of spinach dancing in the wind. By the 6th day, the shifts had become undeniable. The sterile camps had started to collapse. A few cadets abandoned their tents altogether and sought shelter under trees, using natural canopies instead of synthetics. The air had grown warmer, and some began to remove parts of their suits, unwilling to endure the suffocating insulation any longer. Varelion still held her line. Her camp remained elevated on stone platforms, each slab meticulously cleaned, each movement sterilized with rationed wipes. But even she could not mask the visible weight loss, the slight tremble in her hands. She watched from a distance as Jack pulled another harvest, just a few bean pods and a handful of herbs, and distributed them between himself and Purr. That night, under a pale blue moon, Jack lit a low fire from dried twigs and boiled a leaf infusion. It was nothing more than mint and water, but the smell was potent. He sat in silence, sipping slowly, the warmth spreading through his chest. Purr leaned against a tree beside him, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. Neither spoke. The silence between them had become comfortable. Then, without warning, Varelion approached. She did not speak. She stood near the edge of the firelight, arms folded behind her back. Her posture was rigid, but her gaze was locked on the steaming pot. Jack didn't move. He let the moment hang in the air. Pierre opened one eye and said, You want something? Varelion's voice came out cold and sharp. I do not want, I require. Jack raised an eyebrow. You require what? A sample, she said, of the human-grown nutrition, for biochemical analysis. Jack scoffed softly. You want a taste? Her jaw tensed. For evaluation purposes. He dipped his spoon into the pot and raised it slowly. Then he poured the contents back in. Then come help me water the eastern rose tomorrow. Varelion didn't reply. She turned and walked back into the dark without accepting or refusing. The next morning she arrived just before dawn. Jack said nothing. He handed her a hollowed-out gourd filled with water. She stared at it as though it were a weapon, then took it with a gloved hand. As she knelt awkwardly beside a row of spinach, her movements stiff and mechanical, Jack leaned in and said, You can take the gloves off. The planet won't kill you. She removed them with visible hesitation. The first time her bare hand touched the soil, her breath caught slightly. She paused, frozen in place, as if expecting a chemical burn or some vile reaction. But nothing happened. The soil was warm, soft, textured. She pressed it lightly, then deeper. She poured the water slowly, and the dirt swallowed it in silence. By afternoon, more cadets had joined. Some helped build windbreaks around the mint patches. Others wove grass mats to protect new seedlings from the sun. The garden had grown beyond Jack's control, and that was exactly what he wanted. He no longer needed to teach. He just needed to let them touch the dirt. Once they did, the soil taught them the rest. And still, No one said the word dependence, but Jack saw it in the way the cadets waited by the garden during sunrise. He saw it in how Purr handed out mint leaves to those with dry mouths. He saw it in Varelion, who now returned every evening to check the leaf growth without asking permission. It was no longer a human garden, it was the camp's lifeline. The sun climbed steadily into the alien sky, casting amber light over the valley as the first full harvest began. Jack stood at the edge of the garden, hands on his hips, sweat lining his brow, watching the rows sway in the morning wind. The spinach leaves had thickened, the bean vines coiled tightly around their poles, and the basil had exploded in a fragrant cluster that now pulled insects from far beyond the perimeter. Behind him, cadets moved with quiet purpose. The awkwardness of their first days had faded. What remained was focus, fatigue, hunger, and something new, ownership. Cadet Purr knelt beside a patch of mint, her fingers deftly separating new growth from mature sprigs. Jack noticed how her movements had grown more confident. She no longer asked what to do. She simply did it. Cadet Ralvax dragged a woven net made from river vines filled with washed root vegetables, his small frame shaking under the weight. He dropped it beside a flat stone and called out without looking, "Water's low by the eastern trench." Jack nodded. "I'll check the runoff." As he moved past the garden rows, he passed Varelion. She had tied her hair back in a makeshift band and had long since abandoned her gloves. Her hands were streaked with dirt. She crouched low beside the carrots, her forearms braced against her knees as she loosened the soil around one of the larger roots. She glanced up at Jack. 3 more days and we could have enough to ration." Jack wiped his face. "We'll start drying some of it tomorrow. If the weather holds, we can press the herbs, too." She returned to her work without a word. The transformation had reached a point no one could deny. The garden was no longer a curiosity. It was survival. There were still no proper tools, no synthetics, no replication assistance, just dirt, water, hands, and patience. It had taken root not only in the ground, but in the minds of those who once mocked it. At midday, Commander Irkon arrived at the camp. His tall figure emerged from the forest line, flanked by 2 low-ranking observers from the Galactic Academy. He stood silently at the boundary of the clearing, his 3 arms folded as he watched the scene unfold. No one stopped. No one rushed to explain. Jack kept harvesting, Pear kept bundling herbs, and Varelion continued to lay out spinach leaves on woven mats to dry in the sun. After some time, the commander stepped forward. Jack stood and met him near the stream. "You're early," Jack said. "I've observed enough through satellite relay," Irkon replied. "I wanted to see it myself." He looked past Jack to the garden. The rows were uneven, messy, and laced with improvised supports. But everything was alive. Insects hummed between the plants. The soil, once compressed and sterile, now breathed. "You fed the camp," Irkon said. "With dirt," Jack shrugged. "With patience. And seeds." Irkon turned to face him fully. "And pride? Did you bury that too?" Jack smirked. "That's the first thing that had to go in the ground." The commander said nothing for a long moment. Then he moved past Jack, bending low beside a row of beans. He extended one finger and touched the leaves, turning one gently. "Do you know how many generations of cadets have failed this part of the course?" he asked. "I read the stats. And yet each year, few even tried to touch the soil. You did." Jack looked toward the others. "I wasn't the only one by the end." "No," Irkon agreed. "But you were first. And that's what makes the others follow." By late afternoon, the cadets gathered in a wide semicircle as the day's harvest was laid out. No one argued. No one fought over shares. Jack stood near the center with Purr and Varelion, overseeing the division. The leaves were distributed in small bundles, the roots set aside for boiling, the beans counted and passed into palm-sized woven satchels. For the first time since landing, everyone ate without silence. A few cadets laughed. One even hummed softly while chewing. It was the closest thing to peace the camp had known. That evening, under a darkening sky lit with soft bioluminescent clouds, Varelion approached Jack as he stoked the fire beside his shelter. "I spoke with the observers," she said. He glanced up. "Let me guess. You want to file a formal report about unsanitary methods?" "No," she said, lowering herself to sit beside him. I told them this was the first survival course that actually taught something. He tossed another stick into the fire. They probably didn't believe you. They did, she said. And they asked for a full documentation, seed types, soil adjustments, water collection ratios. Jack whistled softly. That's a first. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. You changed the test. No, he said. The test changed me. The rest just caught up. Behind them, Pier curled up beside a half-empty crate of dried herbs, using her folded arm as a pillow. Ralvax was asleep beside the roots, curled into a makeshift blanket stitched from leaves and twine. The others had settled into sleep one by one, some in shelters, some in the open, but none in fear. Jack stood and walked back to the garden. The night wind tugged gently at the vines. He crouched low beside the beans, touching one last leaf before rising again. The stars above glimmered quietly, as if watching, as if remembering. Irkon's voice echoed in his memory. Survival is not about strategy. It is about surrendering pride. He understood that now. He had lived it. And through that surrender, something had grown. Something real, something shared, something rooted. When the retrieval shuttle descended 2 days later, the garden remained untouched. Jack left it behind with instructions for the next group. Let the soil do the teaching. It always would.